Well, good morning, everyone. How are you today? We have another one of our virtual events from Hobby Memorial Library in Central Texas College. I'm Cindy Yoser. We have with us Lee Greenthaner, who's always great with us today. And we have one of our very own CTC professors, photography professor Julie Andrada. She's going to be talking with us today about the 100-year history of photography. She has amazing pictures that she was showing us before this event. Before we get started, I want to remind you if you need attendance credit, make sure you go to the library website, find the word events, go ahead and click on in there, and it'll give you a registration form to fill out. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So, everyone, let's welcome Professor Julie Andrada and take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, and welcome. I appreciate the great introduction. So today I am speaking to you from Round Rock, Texas. I am the photography instructor at CTC. I teach darkroom photography and digital photography. My education is in photography, both traditional darkroom methods and digital. And I've had a love affair with photography since I was 16 when I took my first darkroom class. So this morning I'd like to talk to you about some of the high points of how quickly this medium has changed in not even 200 years old. It's the first 100 years really saw a lot of dramatic changes. And I'd like you to keep in mind this number, 200 years. Photography is not even 200 years. And we went from really big, boxy cameras and equipment and really horrible chemicals to our phones. And that's really a huge speed of changes in anything, but particularly when you look at how other uh, art forms, painting, sculpture, for example, have changed. So I'm going to share my screen here with you and get going. And I'm going to start with
There you go. Slip it over a
there we
little
go.
bit. There
Okay,
you
so
go.
this, can you see this? Okay, good. This is what's called a camera lacerda. And this has been around, something that's been used since the Renaissance period. And it was used by artists to sketch portraits, to sketch um, scenes, paintings, buildings, whatever they wanted to end up doing, maybe painting, using watercolors. A lot of them use this device. And so through the years, people started thinking, well, if we can sketch it, why can't we do something and make some sort of permanent image? And that sparks kind of the seeds for what we know today as photography, which when photography was started with the daguerreotypes, was basically the first commercial aspect of photography. Um, it wasn't called photography. So oops, this next image right here, it kind of looks like some hazy scene, some sort of possible landscape. If you're in the Austin area, this image is considered the oldest surviving photograph. It is located on the UT campus at the Ransom Center. A gentleman named Joseph Napis in France, he was experimenting and he wanted to have an image that we use the term today fixed. So this is actually a coated piece of pewter with a cement that he was able to capture out his window for 8 hours. That's how long this exposure is. So he has this, and this is what's considered the oldest surviving photograph, and it was 1826 to 1827, somewhere in that time range. So you can see that it wasn't not even 200 years ago that we were able to finally, people were able to finally take an image and keep it to where we have today. So Mr. Napis partnered with a gentleman, with a gentleman by the name of Louis Daguerre. And Louis Daguerre, they worked to develop the Daguerreotype, which is right here. Sorry, my slide was a little out over here. So this is Louis Daguerre. Louis Daguerre was a showman. He was used different, he did different, put on different spectacles, so to speak. And he was also a scenic painter for plays. And he used the, had the idea to bring about the an image and having portraits. So he worked with he worked with Joseph Napis, and they came up with, which is called today the Daguerreotype. And it was a process, and if you can see here on the left, this is an early, one of the his early daguerreotypes. And if you can look down here, this is the first recorded image of a person in a photograph of what became known as the daguerreotype. So first recorded image. This is a somewhat long exposure, not 8 hours, but it was probably between 1 and 2 hours at the time. And what they did is they developed a system for the daguerreotypes. And unfortunately, Mr. Napis died before Mr. Daguerre was able to present it to the world, which was in August of 1837. And this is here. This, you can kind of see the daguerreotype coming through. This is the picture. This was the camera. And one thing that was interesting with Mr. Daguerre, the daguerreotype was the first successful form of photography. He invented a technique in collaboration with Mr. Napis, Daguerre, and how this was done. They found that if a copper plate coated with silver iodine was exposed to light in a camera, then fumed with mercury vapor, it fixed or made the image permanent. Each one of these images were unique. Each one was placed in, they were placed in very special velvet frames, and they are permanent. You can still find these today, and if they have been kept in a good environment, not exposed to a lot of elements, they still look pretty much like they did when they were taken over 100 years ago. So around the same time that, and this was going on in France, and across the channel in England, we have a gentleman by the name of Henry Talbot Fox, who was a gentleman scientist, so to speak. I've never really found exactly what his occupation was per se. He wasn't like a banker or going to an office job. He had a family property, and he liked to experiment with he liked to experiment and considered himself a creative person. Well, when he went on his honeymoon in Lake Como, he was getting frustrated because he was using a camera Lucinda to sketch, but even with that, he was totally horrible at it. So he was, in his mind, the seed was planted that, wow, wouldn't it be great if I could take this scene and just keep it the way I see it forever? And so he came back from his honeymoon and got busy experimenting with different chemicals that they already knew could hold an image. And the problem was, and what Daguerre and Napis were solving the problem, was to keep that image permanent. So Mr. Talbot Fox came back and he made these little cameras, and you can see one here. It's 2 inches. Usually they're like 2 to 3 inches, very mini. And he put them around his property with uh, I will get this straight, coated with salt and brushed with a solution of silver nitrate, which he knew darkened in the sun. So he coated the watercolor paper, put them in these cameras. These lenses were like for microscopes and other small, perhaps maybe a telescope, but and put them around his property and started experimenting with it. And this right here is considered the first negative. You can see it over here. This is from, it's a lattice window. It was at his home at Lockhart Abbey in England, and the date is August 1835. So in the 30s, 1830s, we can see that there's a lot of movement going on with photography, with these two gentlemen taking very different approaches. So we're going to go up here to, this is another daguerreotype. And one thing about the daguerreotypes is to order to finance their this endeavor, Louis Daguerre, after the peace died, he made a deal with the French government, which paid him and Mr. Napis's son a pension. So they were able to work and continue working. The French government, in turn, after this was presented in 1839, they gave they opened it up to the world. So if you wanted to know how to do daguerreotypes and how to make the camera and get the equipments, it was free, except for England, where Mr. Talbot Fox, excuse me. And that was because the governments could never agree on any financial support. So why is this all important and all excited to me? Well, up until this time, nobody knew. The only people who could really have their portraits done or painting of a likeness were through portraiture, and you had to be wealthy, you know, royalty, aristocrats, the clergy. They were the ones that would have their portrait painted. Otherwise, we didn't have, the general people did not have their portraits taken for the painted for the most part, because it was expensive. With the daguerreotype process, that actually allowed people to have their portraits made with a photograph. So you would have it, which I've always found, you know, a lot of people, you know, we take for granted today. We can take a photo today with a camera and send it to our relatives across the country like that. Wasn't the case back in the 1800s. So one of the persons who really took this to heart was a gentleman by the name of Matthew B. Brady. And Mr. Brady was here in the United States. The United States really embraced this idea of having your portrait made. And there were studios set up in the big cities. They were very elaborate. There was a lot of thought into scenes and props. Very much an experience to go and have your portrait made. And Mr. Brady, excuse me, was very famous for doing that. And as you can see on the portrait on the right, this might look familiar because that's our president, President Lincoln, who this portrait was actually later on to go on the penny. And then this is another one. You can see how these were framed up, very beautifully framed, very, you know, elegantly presented once you had your portrait done. The one drawback with these portraits is that they couldn't be reproduced, but they became something to have for about 20 years, from about 1840 to about 1860. Um, People got their daguerreotypes done. And it was really something that was, it was something to have. It was much more available to the masses, could have this done. And it's really kind of changed the way people, if you, there's other, all of a sudden you could see portraits, or you could have your portrait made and send it to a loved one who lived in another area of the country or overseas, and just kind of stop and think about that for a moment, because it's something that we totally take for granted today. So another thing that now, photographers, I don't know if it's because they're smelling so many chemicals or what, but they tend to be a little crazy. So Mr. Brady, what he did, he's also known for, is he thought that when the Civil War broke out, he and a group of photographers, they documented the Civil War, the battles, the battlefields, the death, the destruction, the good and the bad that happened with the Civil War. And Mr. Brady thought for some reason that people would want coffee table books and pictures of this event. I'm not quite sure why. And obviously others weren't quite sure why, because he lost his money and he was able to come back. But yeah, he kind of put all his eggs in that basket and it didn't go well for him. But another thing with photography is that you do have other things being documented at the time other than portraits, and it opened up the world to people that they had already read about. When we go back to Mr. Brady, his documentation, one thing that's kind of an interesting side note about their documentation of the Civil War is that they would actually place bodies and things. They would rearrange the compositions for aesthetic purposes, so to speak, which was kind of a gruesome thing that they did during that time. Getting back to Mr. Talbot, they were going forward with other experiments in photography, and he came up with what's called the salted paper process, which was a way to have positive and negatives, and they were starting to reproduce the photographs. One of the things used with this process that was coming along, you have the development out process, and then you have John Herschel. And John Herschel contributed, he was another Englishman that contributed to photography in the form of cyanotypes. Now, this may look familiar to you. These are cyanotypes. These were done by a woman who, her name was Anna Atkins. She was British. And these are actually the blueprints for, used for blueprints, would become blueprints. But she used them to take what's called botanicals. So she would take her fern, for example, here on the left, she would take that, coat a piece of paper with chemicals, and the chemicals were, let me get ready to slaughter the names here. I have them written down. Excuse me for just a second. Ammonium ferric citrate and potassium ferricyanide. So when you mix these two together and coat a piece of paper, usually watercolor, it becomes light sensitive. You put the whatever it is you want to record, in this case, like a piece of fern. She went and did botanicals in England. You put that through, put it under a piece of glass, and you set it out in the sun for a certain amount of time. And usually about when we do this here, and I actually do this with my students on campus, it usually takes, 5 or 6 minutes, and you take them back in, you wash it, and you have a permanent record of a botanical or whatever it is you're wanting to do, or blueprints. And this is a process, I don't think blueprints are used today, but this is a process that's still used um, uh, by artists today. Like I said, I still make these, my students make them during classes. And she was the first woman to have a book published of these. And I thought she was important to include in this talk because it was very much a male dominated industry, so to speak, during the development, even though women did make a lot of contributions. So she did the cyanotypes that we see today. Along all this, we kind of have a shift after 1860. There was a development of what's called the wet collodion process. And the wet collodion process was developed by Frederick Archer in 1851. And the process involved adding soluble iodine to a solution of collodion and coating glass plates with the mixture. Now, one thing, and this is what Brady actually used to photograph the Civil War, but you have plates of glass that are like 4 inches or 5 inch, 4x5, 5x7, a plate of glass is coated with light sensitive emulsion, and then it's put into a back of a camera and exposed. All this while being done while that emulsion had to be wet. And then it's exposed, much shorter exposures than the original 8-hour one we saw in the first surviving photographs. And it comes back, and they were able to take these negatives and contact print them. And once again, you start seeing multiple images of one negative, which was something you wouldn't be able to do with the daguerreotypes. Along this line, just to throw this in, now this is a beautiful image, and this is what's considered the first durable color image, color photographs. Now, color photography, as we know, it didn't come along until about 1920, 1930s in that era. But what a Scottish mathematical physicist, James Clerk Maxwell, he produced this photograph. It's tartan ribbon, and he was photographed 3 times through red, blue, and yellow filters. Then you combine the images into one color composition. So this is a combination of 3 different images of the same images through color, and they put it together and we're able to come up with this. And I just thought I'd throw it in there because most of us are used to looking at images in color, but it wasn't that the images through the 1800s and early 1900s were actually done in black and white. Moving on, this right here, if you look right here, you can see the collodion process taking place on location. The photo of the left is of by William Henry Jackson. It's of Yosemite. Now, in 1872, and it started in 1870, we had the U.S. Geological Surveys going out and mapping and documenting the western part of the United States. These went on for several years. There were a few of them, and they had photographers and painters go along to document. Now, if you look at this setup right here, and this has been hand colored, but you have plates, this is something that's dark inside. So what the photographer, in this case, William Henry Jackson, they would have to work in the dark to coat and sensitize their glass plates, move them to the camera, take the exposure, bring it back, process it, and dry it. And then they had a glass plate that they could contact print and make a print. And this was all done. They usually carried about 300 pounds of equipment, if not more. They had pack mules and horses and went up, rocky terrain and steep terrain. And the transportation took an added significance because of the amount of equipment. First, the photography had to be light sensitized, like I said. Um, Plates were developed, fixed, washed, and dried over alcohol lamps, which is what you see them doing down here. And then varnished to protect the image. And all this had to take place on location with all this equipment um, within minutes, or else it wouldn't work. And one thing to keep in mind is that these plates that they were making sometimes were anywhere from 4 by 5 inches to, let me see, like 11 by 14 inches. Some of these cameras were huge. So here's 11 inches right here, right there. So you can kind of see, oop, there we go. Sorry about the thing. And then by 14. So you can see very large, very cumbersome. Amazing that they got what they did. And one thing I want to touch on this is that they went and did all this work, and it was used. They took Jackson's uh, prints, images that he made, and had them printed up and gave to members of Congress. And this directly, indirectly, however you want to do it, he made beautiful images. And that led to Ulysses President Grant dedicating Yellowstone National Park in 1872. So that kind of led to people who were like amazed, and there were not only photographers like William Henry Jackson, but there was photographers going all over the world. So people, maybe you were sitting in Texas, or I guess it would have been the Republic of Texas at the time, but you were sitting at home in New York or in California, or you were in school and you read about the Egyptian pyramids, and you were reading about Egyptian pyramids, places in Italy, places in England. Well, now with photography, photographers were going out in the world and taking pictures, and these pictures were then being made into postcards, prints through the collodion process, and they were able to be distributed, and people could actually see the world around them. It brought the world into people's homes and places so they could see what was going on around them. So that's, one of the impacts of photography. And just as a side note, I know people talk about, photos are fake and this, that, and the other thing. With Photoshop today, everything's, oh, that was Photoshop, Photoshop, Photoshop. And I don't have any examples in this, but it was done with these photos too. So it's been around for a long time. It's been out there. And just know that photography, yes, it brings the real world to us, but it can be enhanced, so to speak. Now, this gentleman is very interesting, and maybe you have heard of him. His name is Edward Mulbridge, and he was born in England, came to the United States. He was born Edward James Muggeridge, and then he anglicized his name. He was quite the character. He was a prolific photographer, inventor, really stepped forward the photography process, used the collodion process, as well went to dry plates when that became available. He did landscapes, he photographed San Francisco. He also murdered his wife's boyfriend, but got off because he claimed insanity. Like I said, quite a character. But what he did is he did studies for Leland Stanford, who was industrialist. And Leland Stanford at his farm, which is now Stanford University, he had a bet, and Mulbridge went out to uh, prove the bet with emotion studies. And uh, will a horse get all four legs off the ground when galloping? So Mulbridge set that up. He had cameras lined up that tripwired as the jockey and the horse went past, and he was able to prove that. His experiments with motion in 1879, um, and he went on to do other uh, motion studies. Um, his work was widely published, and then people said, "Oh no, that's not fake. That's fake. That didn't happen." So he actually went on tour. He was criticized and said it never really happened. And then the lectures were, he went on tour and the lectures were illuminated with what he developed as a Daguerreotype, and he was able to prove them wrong. And the Daguerreotype was actually like, it's a disc that he runs through a lantern that shows the motion of the horses as it goes through. It was kind of an early predecessor to cinema as we know it today, and it was a sensation at the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893 in Chicago. He also made important photographic studies of motion on other species and other people and movement with under the University of Pennsylvania. So he was very well known for his contribution to photography as far as motion studies and how photography can be used to um, uh, enlighten people, so to speak. Um, Mr. Eastman, we have the Kodak camera going forward, and this was about 1888. Now, many of you have probably heard of Kodak. Kodak was the go-to film paper photography companies for many years. They actually even developed the uh, digital technology back in the late 1970s, 80s, and they didn't do anything with it. So since they didn't really do anything with it, they lost their status, went bankrupt, and they are now on the rebirth. But Kodak took photography and took it to the next level for everybody to have a camera. So his motto was, you press the button, we do the rest. He developed his first camera, which came out in 1888. It was the original Kodak camera, sold for $25. It was a box. It came preloaded with film for 100 images. You took the photos and you sent it back to Kodak. They processed the pictures and sent them all back to you, and with your camera with new film in it. And you know, $25 at the time was a lot of money. And he came then with cheaper cameras, including the Brownie, for, you know, at the time it was about $700 in today's. If we were to go out, what the $25 was equivalent to. So he was quite the character. Kodak he was from Rochester, New York, and he loved photography. He was very passionate about it, very himself a practitioner of photography, and he made all these developments with photography, taking it to um, the masses, so to speak. And as prices came down and things came down, more and more people got into photography. You know, they're going on vacation, they would take the camera along with them and document it. So he was really the snapshot person who got the snapshot going. And today, if you go to, there's the George Eastman Museum, which has a lot of great information on the history, and really their archives is amazing as to the different processes that people went through. Pretty incredible, and I like that it is coming back, because I thought it was really sad that they didn't keep up with the technology, and they suffered for it. Couple things here. These are images um, uh, by a gentleman by the name of Alfred Stieglitz. And around the late 1800s, turn of the century, people were becoming more and more involved in photography. And one of the things is that photography, because of its start and its nature, it hadn't really been considered an art form, even though it is an art form. It's a way that people express themselves. But because of the mechanical aspects of it, the scientific aspects of it, that it was kind of came along by gentlemen scientists, um, it didn't have a lot of street cred, so to speak, with the artistic community. And a gentleman by the name of Alfred Stieglitz set out to change that. And he made an impact. And he went out of his way to advocate for photography being an art form. And with the introduction of the Kodak camera, which was handheld, you saw a picture of it, it's very little. He wanted to change how people thought about photography. So he spearheaded uh, a movement called pictorialism. And these are two examples right here. The image on your right is called Hand of Man, Railroad Stations from 1903. And the photo on the left is Night Reflections from right around 1900. And they're very soft. If you actually see these images in person, they almost took it to an extreme. They were trying to make images that looked almost like paintings, and always very soft, very muted in the lighting. And so he was trying to champion by doing this and having the photographers would paint, they would hand coat their images, they would go through and use different papers. He was really trying to advocate for photography being an art form. And as with most art movements, there was a backlash. And so this is right around he was, mid 1890s through right around 1915, 1920s in that area. And there was a backlash. And the backlash was all of a sudden people wanted to take pride in, hey, I made this photograph. It's sharp. It's beautiful. Why are we doing all these other things to it? And that leads us to the last photographer I'm going to talk about, which was Ansel Adams. Now, Ansel Adams, I'm sure most of you have heard of Ansel Adams. He is probably one of the most well-known photographers that come out of the United States. This is Mr. Adams right here. With his camera, which is a field camera, 4x5 field camera. I have one similar to this, not this one, but I still use one like this. This is him on top of his car, because you do anything as a photographer to get your shot. So he's on top of his car there with his 8x10 camera, meaning his sheets of film are 8 inches by 10 inches, like his camera here, which is 4x5, 4 inches by 5 inches, shooting film. Mr. Adams was quite the character. He was born in San Francisco, studied music, and was given his first camera and went to Yosemite and started photographing and fell in love with photography. Ditched the career as a musician and became a photographer. His images today sell for tens of thousands of dollars, and I think one of his images sold for was maybe $1,200 at the time during his life. He didn't make uh, uh, tons of money like they are today. His uh, heirs do, but he came back by using the system, they were always, he was one of the founders of what's called the group F64. F64 stands for an aperture opening of the camera, which is small, which gives crisp, sharp images. And he was also developed with Fred Archer the zone system, which gave very beautiful tonality to his black and white images using exposures and development and filters. And so he was also a great conservationist. He was the Sierra Club used his work for many, many years and still do, because my calendar last year uh, had his images in it. So he was kind of the founding father of the landscape movement and moved forward the thought of art, of photography being an art form. And that's what I have. Do we have any questions?
There's none on Facebook right now.
I actually have some questions. In the very early photographers, you were mentioning this chemical and that chemical, and a lot of those chemicals seem like they are poisonous.
They are, which led to, yes, and that exactly why I think it moves so fast, because they are highly toxic chemicals. And one of the things, let me go back and get my notes here. A gentleman by the name of John Herschel. We have the wet plate. We have the gelatin process, which is what we use today. So they take the chemicals and they put them, they're suspended in gelatin, which is you see in the film and the paper. And one of the reasons that came about was that the other chemicals were so toxic and it was making photographers sick. So that was one of the, moving it forward. And I think a lot of ways that's why it moved really fast. When you think about it, it's not even 200 years old as a art form or as a just being with us. Oh, hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Next, do you have another question?
Um, well, I actually wanted to ask you about those cyanotypes, is that what?
Cyanotypes, yes.
Cyanotype. I know that now, I've used those where you can just buy a packet.
Yep,
Um,
absolutely. Yes.
so is the same chemical on
Yep.
top,
Yep.
and it's not poisonous, right?
Well, I wouldn't drink it, but it says not to drink it and wash your hands. Now, the chemicals used on the sunprints, which I've used those too, they're lots of fun. And those chemicals are coated on there and dried, which we do these on campus. I don't know if you've ever noticed, we'll be out there working on these. But it's the same chemicals, and then you wash them and they are permanent. One thing, what I do is I buy the pre-mixed chemicals that come in 2 bottles from B&H and pour them together equal parts, stir them up, and then we coat them. We coat thick watercolor paper, works the best. So we have that. We have let it dry and then take them out into the sun. You can also use a dedicated UV light for it. I don't have that, so I just use the sun. But yes, those chemicals, like I said, you don't want to drink them. But I think if you're buying the paper, because those are marketed to children in a lot of places, I think those are probably a better bet for that.
Okay. I've noticed that you said that, in the very early cameras, that were they using the chemicals to develop, or were they using, was there some type of a chemical actually in the camera itself? Because I know, we don't have that now.
Well, what it was is that there was the camera, um, for example, the daguerreotypes, when they had the polished uh, chrome, it was coated, put in there, and then they had little boxes. Let me see if you can see one here. Let me go back here a couple slides. And they actually had individual boxes that they were put in and processed. You can kind of see here, this right here, you can see that's where the processing would take place. And you can tell it would be light tight. They put them in there for a certain amount of time, and then you could open it up. Later on, when you got to the use of dark rooms, if you're processing film and it's not in a secure tank, or not in a secure tank, you have to do that completely in the dark. But it's not done in cameras per se, like say a Polaroid camera. If you have a Polaroid camera or an instant camera that shoots out a piece of film, all that chemistry, and particularly the Polaroid, for example, you take a snap with your Polaroid camera, which they still have Polaroids on the comeback as well. All the chemicals are pushed out and coated that sheet of film that comes out, that plastic sheet, through the rollers when it comes through. And so that coats the top of the Polaroid. And if you wait usually about 10 minutes, it usually comes out blue. And as it processes out, it brings out the colors.
Yeah, that's fascinating how that, I was going to ask you about the Polaroids because that was,
Yeah, interesting story about the Polaroids. In fact, this is another thing we do with my students. And I have the Fujifilm cameras as well. I'm not quite sure about, it's a different process than the Polaroid. Edwin Land, who was the founder of Polaroid, he was on vacation with his daughters and family in somewhere in late 1940s. And his daughter made the offhand comment of, wow, wouldn't it be neat if we didn't have to wait for our film to be processed and stuff? Hence, now we have the Land that brought about the development of the Land camera, and Polaroid film as we know it. And of course, another thing, that Polaroid company went away. They saved the last processing manufacturing plant in Europe, and they are now bringing back Polaroid today, and people love them. And what we do in my photo 2 class, we call it an emulsion lift. You can actually take a Polaroid, have it processed for 10 minutes, cut the white borders off, soak it in warm water, and lift off, peel apart, and have that emulsion of that image, which almost feels like a gelatin, I don't know, jello-ish type thing. And you spread it out on a piece of paper. Just let me show you. Excuse me. Don't more turn my back. So this image of my kitty cat, that actually started out as a Polaroid print.
can you make it bigger by maybe stop sharing the PowerPoint and
Oh, okay,
we can
sure.
see it, please? Thank you. Okay, thank you.
Is that better?
Yes.
So that's what I did. And this is actually started as a Polaroid. And this on top right here is just the Polaroid emulsion that I lifted off from the layers and put it on a piece of watercolor paper.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
So there's all sorts of things. And, you're asking about cyanotypes. Another thing you can do is you can take, in the photography world, there's you have in the dark, working in dark in a black and white lab, you have fiber-based paper and resin-coated papers. Resin-coated paper is what we use because it dries faster. But if you take fiber-based paper, similar to making a cyanotype, and just take the paper take some flowers, put it out in the sun for, this one was 40, this one was 30 minutes, and just fix it. Take it back in the darkroom and just fix it to make the image permanent. You can come up with botanicals. Can you see that?
That was just, yes, that was just putting something on a piece of paper,
Uh-huh.
waiting in the sun.
In the sun. So this was a flower. I went to HEB and got the $3.99 consumers. And so I put it out in the sun under a piece of glass for about 30 minutes.
Wow.
And this
That's
is, so there's
amazing.
all sorts of like, there's like tons and tons and tons of things that, you know, you can do with photography. That's been done with photography. You know, I tried to hit some of the high points of things. Have any other questions?
Let's see.
There's still none on Facebook.
Huh?
Okay. Well, um, we're almost out of time there. So what I'm going to do is we'll wrap it up, but let me tell you what, if you you know, anyone has any questions, you could put it in the comments, or are they able to contact you, Professor Andrada, with any
Yeah,
other questions?
they can send me questions to
Oh,
Julie Andrada at ctcd.edu. So JULIE period ANDRADA at CTCD. Don't forget the D.
right.
Did that
Right.
when I first started. .edu.
Yeah, because it's, and definitely, guys, it sounds like, well, in general, photography is amazing. And
Yep.
I know it's one of my favorite hobbies, and it can also be a career, definitely be a
Yeah.
career.
Yeah.
So if you're interested in these techniques, please do consider looking at the photography class,
Yes,
or
please.
contacting Professor Andrada. And it sounds like you'll be learning some amazing techniques.
We
I'm
try our best.
I'm still trying to convince you to do it, like, you know, after hours, so that I can take your course. I
You
have
know,
to
we're thinking
work.
of we're thinking of I would be up for it. It would depend on what my other teaching schedule looks like.
Right,
So I would love to do an evening class, but I
right.
also don't want to start at 8:30 in the morning, because that makes, you know, you'd have to wake me up. I would be like, okay, it's time for my bed. I need to go.
Well, and just to get everybody excited, we are in the talks about in the fall doing a photography event. So definitely, you know, keep in touch with us, and
Oh yeah.
we'll be bringing more of this, because this is such an exciting subject.
Yeah, it
So.
really is, and there's a lot of directions you can go. You don't really have to invest a ton of money in it. Um, so it is, yeah, there's a lot that we can do with it.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Don't go away yet.
Okay.
Thank you so much for the exciting lesson today on the history of photography. And for everyone, starting right early Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday at noon, we have our Workforce Solutions people coming out, and they're going to be talking about the skills that you need to get a job, to start a job, and to keep a job. So this is great information for all of you who actually, you know, have to work for a living, which is like everybody we know.
Everybody, yeah.
Yeah, so make sure that you check that out at noon on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Thank you again, Professor Andrada.
Thank you for having me. It was fun. I'm over my nerves now, I think.
Oh, yeah, no,
First one,
you did.
first one under my belt. So
Yeah, this what did Lee, we're into our 40s now of how many things we've done. So thank
exactly.
thank you again. And guys, you guys have an amazing weekend,
Yeah.
and we will see you on Monday. So okay, Lee, take us out, and don't go away yet,
I
Professor
won't
Andrada.